In the early 1940s, the world stood on the edge of collapse. Empires stretched across continents, resources were disappearing, and diplomacy had failed where trust once existed. Japan, isolated by economic pressure and surrounded by rival powers, faced a defining choice. In one timeline, this choice led to devastation. In another, far less remembered world, it led to something entirely different. This is the story of how Japan won the World War, not through endless destruction, but through strategy, restraint, and a vision that reshaped global power. Japan entered the conflict acutely aware of its limitations. Unlike industrial giants such as the United States, Japan could not afford a long war of attrition. Its leaders understood that overwhelming force alone would guarantee eventual defeat. What Japan needed was time, leverage, and influence. Quietly, a new strategic doctrine began to form within the upper ranks of the Imperial Navy. It was built on a belief that war could be won not by annihilation, but by control. The goal was not to crush enemies completely, but to disrupt systems so effectively that opponents would hesitate, divide, and eventually negotiate. Instead of launching an all-consuming assault designed to provoke fury, Japan executed a calculated opening move. The Pacific Fleet was targeted not for destruction, but for paralysis. Precision operations disrupted logistics, repair facilities, and command coordination. The impact was immediate and deeply unsettling. Warships remained afloat, but they could not move. Aircraft sat grounded without clear orders. The psychological effect was enormous. The United States was wounded but not enraged to the point of unified retaliation. Confusion spread faster than outrage, and hesitation replaced certainty. This hesitation became Japan's first major advantage. While American leadership debated its next steps, Japan moved swiftly across Southeast Asia, but with a radically different approach. Military actions were limited, strategic, and paired with political outreach. Rather than replacing local leadership with direct occupation, Japan supported regional councils, promising autonomy and development in exchange for cooperation. For populations long governed by distant colonial powers, this approach felt less like conquest and more like opportunity. Resistance collapsed not through brute force, but through negotiation. Infrastructure remained intact. Cities continued to function. International observers began to notice the difference. This was not a war driven by devastation, but by positioning. Japan was no longer simply expanding territory, it was reshaping perception. Behind closed doors, diplomats worked through neutral intermediaries. Messages crossed oceans without threats or ultimatums. Japan framed the conflict as a dispute over resources and security, solvable through structured compromise rather than endless bloodshed. Within the United States, this narrative created division. Insulationist voices gained strength, warning that total war would drain the nation for generations. Without a single catastrophic event to unify public anger, consensus fractured. Japan had transformed outrage into debate and debate into delay. As Europe burned and global attention shifted westward, Japan avoided deep entanglement, positioning itself as an independent actor rather than an extension of another empire's ambition. Inside Japan, hardline factions demanded total war, but their influence weakened as early successes validated restraint. Civilian leaders gained authority. Strategy replaced impulse. Survival replaced spectacle. By the end of this phase, Japan controlled vast territory, yet much of it remained functional rather than devastated. Ports operated, railways ran, economies endured. The war had not ended, but it had changed shape. What began as a global military confrontation was becoming a contest of influence, legitimacy, and endurance. Japan had not yet secured victory, but it had successfully avoided defeat. And in a war where survival was the first requirement for victory, that alone marked the turning point that would change everything. By 1943, the war had entered a strange new phase. The guns had not fallen silent, but the rhythm of conflict had changed. What many expected to become a global inferno instead slowed into a tense and uncertain stalemate. Japan had achieved something few believed possible. It had expanded its influence without igniting total retaliation. While other powers bled resources and morale, Japan conserved strength and waited. Across the Pacific, American shipyards worked relentlessly to repair damaged fleets. Factories produced aircraft and warships at staggering speed. Yet, despite this industrial momentum, political unity remained fragile. Without a single moment of overwhelming catastrophe to unify public resolve, American leadership remained divided. Some demanded decisive action, others urged caution, warning that an extended war across multiple continents could exhaust the nation. Japan understood this division and quietly reinforced it through diplomacy. Neutral intermediaries carried messages emphasizing restraint, negotiation, and mutual exhaustion. Every delay worked in Japan's favor. Meanwhile, Japan consolidated its position in Southeast Asia. Rather than advancing recklessly, it focused on stabilizing territory already under influence. Ports reopened, trade resumed, local administrations were strengthened rather than replaced. This strategy reshaped regional perceptions. For many Asian communities long governed by distant empires, Japanese involvement felt less destructive than previous colonial rule. While suspicion remained, cooperation increased. Japan then turned its attention toward India. British authority there was already strained by years of war and political unrest. Independence movements gained momentum, and Japan recognized an opportunity that did not require invasion. Through discreet diplomatic channels, Japan supported discussions of autonomy and regional self-governance. These conversations weakened British strategic stability without requiring direct confrontation. While Europe remained locked in brutal conflict, Japan deliberately avoided deep military entanglement. Germany's campaigns consumed enormous resources and attention. Japan observed carefully, learning from every mistake. Instead of matching aggression with aggression, Japan invested heavily in innovation. New aircraft designs prioritized range, efficiency, and coordination. Naval doctrine shifted toward intelligence, mobility, and deterrence rather than confrontation. These developments forced rival powers to reconsider their strategies. Direct assaults now carried higher risks. The cost of escalation grew harder to justify. Within Japan, political power continued to shift. Civilian leaders gained influence over military hardliners. Strategy meetings focused less on conquest and more on sustainability. By 1944, the war's center of gravity had moved away from battlefields toward negotiation tables. Behind closed doors, talks began to emerge between major powers, exploring ceasefires and regional stability. Japan's greatest achievement during this phase was not territorial expansion, but credibility. It had proven capable of restraint. It had shown that power could be exercised without total destruction. The world had not yet embraced peace, but it was no longer rushing blindly toward annihilation. And in this slowing of momentum, Japan gained the leverage it needed to shape what would come next. As the year drew to a close, nations everywhere sensed the shift. The war was no longer simply about who could strike hardest. It was becoming a struggle over endurance, legitimacy, and the future balance of the world. By 1945, the world found itself in an unfamiliar position. The war that once threatened to consume entire continents had slowed. Weapons remained, armies stood ready, but momentum had shifted away from open confrontation. Japan's strategy of restraint and leverage had altered the course of events. Instead of forcing a final, devastating conclusion, the conflict evolved into a fragile balance maintained by exhaustion, uncertainty, and cautious diplomacy. Across Asia, regions once ruled by distant empires began forming new political identities. Administrative councils replaced colonial offices. Trade networks resumed. Education systems reopened. Stability, though imperfect, returned. Japan's role in this transition remained controversial. Some viewed its presence as pragmatic cooperation. Others saw lingering influence beneath the surface. Yet compared to the chaos of total war, order itself became a form of relief. Rather than imposing direct control, Japan promoted economic partnerships. Infrastructure projects replaced military expansion. Roads, ports, and communication lines became the new instruments of influence. Meanwhile, in Europe, the war's toll weighed heavily. Cities required rebuilding. Economies struggled to recover. Political divisions deepened as nations searched for security without repeating the past. The absence of a decisive military conclusion created unease. Without clear victory or defeat, the world faced a question it had never confronted before. How does a global war end without collapse? In response, diplomatic initiatives expanded. Conferences replaced campaigns. Agreements focused on ceasefires, resource sharing, and mutual restraint rather than punishment or domination. Japan positioned itself as a mediator rather than an aggressor, hosting negotiations, supporting neutral oversight, and encouraging economic recovery allowed it to redefine its international image. This shift did not erase suspicion. Memories of conflict remained vivid. Survivors demanded acknowledgement. Governments debated responsibility and reconciliation. Peace, it became clear, required more than silence on the battlefield. Within Japan, public debate intensified. Citizens questioned how history would remember this war. Educators, writers, and scholars argued over narrative, accountability, and national identity. Rather than suppressing these discussions, Japan allowed them to unfold openly. Cultural exchange programs expanded. Students traveled abroad. Perspectives broadened. Across Asia and beyond, nations emerging from colonial rule watched closely. Japan's transformation suggested that power could evolve beyond conquest toward cooperation. Yet beneath the surface, unresolved tensions remained. Political factions everywhere argued over the future. Some demanded stronger defenses. Others warned that renewed militarization would undo everything achieved. The war had not ended through triumph, but through fatigue and adaptation. The world now stood in a fragile pause, uncertain whether peace would deepen or fracture under pressure. Japan had not claimed victory in the traditional sense. Instead, it had helped reshape the meaning of victory itself. Survival, stability, and influence now carried greater weight than conquest. As 1946 approached, the question was no longer who would win the war, but whether humanity could move forward without repeating it. By 1948, the world had entered a cautious new era. Nations were exhausted but alert. The battlefields of the past had not completely disappeared, yet the tone of global conflict had shifted. Strategy, influence, and negotiation had replaced raw aggression as the primary tools of power. Japan now stood at a critical juncture. Its approach had changed the course of events in Asia. It had not relied on total war or unchecked aggression. Instead, it had built credibility, stabilized regions, and reshaped perceptions of power. In cities across Southeast Asia, infrastructure projects continued. Ports and railways, once at risk of destruction, now operated efficiently. Local governance flourished with guidance rather than coercion. Populations began to associate Japan with order, stability, and growth, rather than fear. Japan's military remained a powerful deterrent, yet it was no longer the sole measure of influence. Technological innovation, diplomacy, and resource management had become equally, if not more, important. Aircraft, ships, and logistical networks were optimized for flexibility, speed, and intelligence, rather than brute force. Across the Pacific, former adversaries watched cautiously. The United States, Europe, and the remnants of colonial empires recognized that Japan had succeeded in creating leverage without provocation. Hesitation and caution now governed international decisions. In India and Indochina, Japan continued to encourage regional councils and local autonomy. Policies that might have sparked rebellion instead fostered participation in governance. Infrastructure improvements and trade initiatives strengthened economic networks without confrontation. Japan's approach created a ripple effect across Asia. Stability encouraged trade, trade encouraged cooperation, cooperation in turn reinforced Japan's influence. Unlike traditional conquest, this strategy relied on subtle, enduring networks of power. Meanwhile, Europe remained fractured and weary. Nations struggled to rebuild cities, economies, and populations. Observers noted that Japan's model of influence through stability was yielding results that brute force had failed to achieve elsewhere. Japan also invested heavily in knowledge and cultural exchange. Students, scholars, and scientists traveled across Asia to study infrastructure, governance, and industry. Ideas moved as quickly as resources, creating intellectual influence that reinforced military and economic power. Internally, Japan faced reflection. Citizens and leaders debated history, ethics, and national identity. Unlike previous generations, the focus was not simply on expansion, but on shaping a legacy. Education and discourse became tools to consolidate Japan's vision of responsible influence. Internationally, Japan's conferences and treaties strengthened regional stability. Former rivals were cautious, but most accepted the frameworks Japan proposed because they avoided renewed conflict. Gradually, Japan's influence became institutional rather than purely military. By 1949, the concept of victory had transformed. Japan had not achieved conquest in the traditional sense. Instead, it had secured survival, stability, and a position of enduring influence. Power was measured not in destruction, but in the ability to shape the future. Across Asia and the Pacific, the world watched. The lessons were subtle but profound. Nations realized that conflict could be managed through negotiation, careful planning, and long-term strategy. Japan had created a new model of global influence. At the same time, unresolved tensions remained. Old rivalries, territorial claims, and competing ambitions had not vanished. Yet Japan's success demonstrated that restraint, intelligence, and diplomacy could outweigh brute force in the modern era. As the decade closed, Japan's vision of influence was clear. It had turned survival into leverage, strategy into power, and restraint into a form of victory that reshaped global norms. The war had not ended through annihilation, but through foresight, patience, and careful planning. In the end, Japan's victory was a quiet one. It did not dominate the headlines with explosions or conquest. Instead, it won by demonstrating that influence, credibility, and stability could redefine what it meant to prevail in a global conflict.